There's a voice that speaks to the deepest part of every human heart. It is not always loud. It does not compete with the shouting of the world. And it does not force itself upon anyone. Yet it carries a power greater than the voices of culture, opinion, and circumstance. It is the voice of God. From the very beginning of human history, God has spoken to mankind. He spoke into the darkness and created light. He spoke to prophets and kings. He spoke through his word and through the quiet conviction that reaches into the conscience of every person. Inspired by the preaching style of Adrian Rogers, we are reminded that the voice of God is not a relic of the past. It is a living reality that continues to call people today. God still speaks to the human heart through many ways. First, he speaks through his word. The scriptures are not simply ancient writings or historical records. They are the living message of God to humanity. When a person reads the Bible, it is not merely reading words on a page. There are moments when those words seem to rise from the page and speak directly to the soul. A verse that may have been read many times suddenly feels personal, direct, and powerful. It exposes hidden thoughts, reveals truth, and brings clarity where confusion once lived. That is because the Word of God is not silent, it is alive, and through it God continues to communicate his truth to the hearts of those who are willing to listen. God also speaks through the conscience. Deep within every person there's a moral awareness that distinguishes right from wrong. Even people who claim no belief in God often experience that inner voice that whispers when something is wrong and affirms when something is right. That inner conviction is not merely the result of social training or cultural influence. It is a reflection of the moral law written on the human heart. When a person is about to make a harmful decision, there's often a quiet warning within them, a sense that they should stop, reconsider, or turn away. That warning is one of the ways God speaks. It is gentle but persistent, guiding people away from choices that lead to destruction and toward choices that bring life. God speaks through circumstances as well. Life is filled with moments that force people to pause and reflect. Sometimes it is a moment of great blessing, where everything seems to fall into place and a person realizes that something greater than chance is at work. At other times, it is a moment of difficulty, a challenge that shakes a person in confidence and causes them to search for meaning beyond their own strength. In both joy and hardship, God often uses circumstances to draw attention to his presence. A door opens unexpectedly. A path becomes clear after a long season of confusion. Or a sudden obstacle prevents a person from continuing in the wrong direction. These moments are not always coincidences. Often they are divine invitations to recognize that God is guiding and speaking even through the events of everyday life. God also speaks through the influence of other people. Sometimes a friend speaks words of wisdom at exactly the right moment. Sometimes a message, a conversation, or even a stranger. As encouragement touches the heart, in a way that cannot easily be explained. Throughout history, God has used individuals to deliver truth to others. A parent guiding a child, a mentor offering advice, a pastor preaching a message, or a simple conversation between friends can become the channel through which God communicates something deeply important. In those moments, the words may come from a human voice, but the truth behind them carries the authority and compassion of God. Yet one of the most remarkable ways God speaks is through the quiet prompting of the Holy Spirit within the human heart. This prompting is not usually dramatic or overwhelming. It often feels like a gentle nudge, a quiet sense that something should be done or avoided. A person may feel an urge to help someone in need, to forgive someone caused pain, to turn away from a harmful habit, or to seek a deeper relationship with God. These inner promptings may be subtle, but they are powerful. They invite the human heart to move toward goodness, truth, and spiritual awakening. The tragedy of the modern world is not that God has stopped speaking, but that people have become surrounded by so much noise that they struggle to hear him. The constant flow of information, entertainment, opinions, and distractions fills every quiet moment. Phones buzz, screens glow, and voices from every direction compete for attention. In the midst of all this noise, the gentle voice of God can easily be ignored. It does not shout over the chaos. It waits for the moment when a person becomes still enough to listen. There are moments in life when people sense this voice more clearly than usual. A person may lie awake at night thinking about the direction their life is taking. Questions arise about purpose, meaning, and eternity. Success, wealth, and recognition may no longer satisfy the deeper hunger of the soul. In that quiet reflection, the heart begins to recognize a call towards something greater. It is the voice of God inviting the person to seek truth beyond the temporary things of the world. Sometimes that voice brings comfort. In moments of sorrow or loneliness, when it seems that no one understands the depth of pain a person feels, there can be a quiet assurance that they are not alone. A sense of peace begins to replace fear, and hope begins to rise where despair once lived. That comfort is not simply emotional relief. It is the presence of God, speaking reassurance to the wounded heart. At other times, the voice of God brings conviction. Conviction is not meant to destroy a person, but to awaken them. When a person recognizes that their actions have been wrong, that their choices have led them away from truth, there may be a deep sense of inner discomfort. That discomfort is often the voice of God calling them back to the path of righteousness. It is an act of mercy, a warning that change is needed before greater consequences fall. God, as voice, is patient. He does not speak once and disappear. Throughout a person's life, again and again, he continues to call, guide, and warn. Sometimes the voice is strong, sometimes it is quiet, but it remains present. The human heart may ignore it for a season, but it often returns in unexpected moments, reminding the soul that it was created for something greater than temporary success or pleasure. Every human being will face moments when they sense this voice clearly. It may come during a time of reflection, during a powerful message, during a crisis, or during an unexpected moment of clarity. In that moment, the heart recognizes that the voice is not ordinary. It carries truth, authority, and love at the same time. It reveals what is hidden and points toward a better way forward. There are many ways a person can ignore the voice of God, and most of them are not loud acts of rebellion, but quiet habits that slowly turn the heart away from truth. Inspired by the preaching style of Adrian Rogers, it becomes clear that ignoring God rarely begins with a dramatic decision. It usually begins with something subtle, something small, something that seems harmless at first. A person hears a gentle conviction in their heart and decides to delay responding. They sense a warning in their conscience and choose to push it aside. They recognize a moment when they should pray, seek guidance, or turn away from a wrong choice. Yet they tell themselves there will be another time. In that quiet moment of hesitation, the process of ignoring God as voice begins. One subtle way people ignore God as voice is through constant distraction. The modern world offers endless forms of entertainment, information, and noise. Every moment can be filled with music, videos, social media, conversations, and endless scrolling. These distractions may seem harmless, yet they create a life where silence becomes rare. When silence disappears, reflection disappears with it. A person rarely pauses long enough to listen to the deeper questions of the soul. The voice of God often speaks in moments of stillness, but a life filled with constant noise leaves little room to hear that voice. Distraction becomes a quiet barrier between the human heart and divine guidance. Another subtle way people ignore God as voice is through rationalization. When a person feels conviction about something they know is wrong, the mind often begins to search for excuses. Instead of responding with humility, the person explains away the warning they feel inside. They tell themselves that everyone else is doing the same thing. They convince themselves that the decision is not really harmful. They create arguments in their own mind to justify behavior that their conscience is already questioning. Rationalization allows a person to silence the voice of truth without feeling immediate guilt. It creates the illusion that everything is acceptable, even when the heart knows something is not right. Ignoring God. This voice can also happen through gradual compromise. Rarely does a person wake up one day and suddenly abandon all the values they once believed. Instead, compromise often happens step by step. A small decision is made that moves slightly away from what is right. At first, the conscience reacts strongly, but the person continues anyway. Later, another decision is made that moves even further away from truth. Each compromise makes the next one easier. Over time, the heart becomes less sensitive to the inner warning that once felt so clear. What once seemed unacceptable slowly becomes normal. The voice that once spoke clearly to the conscience becomes quieter as the person becomes accustomed to ignoring it. Another subtle way people ignore God as voice is through pride. Pride convinces a person that they already know everything they need to know. When pride grows in the heart, humility disappears. A proud person rarely seeks guidance because they believe they are already wise enough to guide themselves. When a warning or correction appears, pride quickly rejects it. Instead of considering whether the message might be true, the person becomes defensive and dismissive. Pride closes the door to learning, growth, and spiritual awareness. It convinces the heart that it does not need direction from anyone, including God. Fear can also lead people to ignore God's voice. Sometimes a person senses that God is calling them to make a difficult change. It may involve leaving a harmful habit, forgiving someone who caused deep pain, stepping into a new responsibility, or trusting God during uncertain circumstances. That call may feel challenging, and fear begins to whisper that the change will be too difficult or too costly. Instead of trusting the voice that calls them forward, the person retreats into the safety of what is familiar. Fear convinces them that ignoring the call is easier than responding to it. Busyness is another powerful way people ignore God's voice without even realizing it. Life becomes filled with responsibilities, work, goals, and endless tasks. A person may wake up early, rush through the day, and collapse into bed at night without ever pausing to reflect on their spiritual life. They may not intentionally reject God's guidance, but they simply never make time to seek it. Days turn into weeks, weeks into months, and months into years. The heart becomes accustomed to living without spiritual direction because it has become too busy to notice what is missing. Some people ignore God's voice through selective listening. They may enjoy hearing messages about comfort, blessings, and encouragement, but they avoid messages that challenge their behavior or call them to repentance. They listen only to what agrees with their desires and ignore what confronts their choices. This selective approach allows them to feel spiritual while avoiding the deeper transformation that God desires in their life. It creates a form of faith that feels comfortable but lacks honesty and surrender. Another subtle way people ignore God's voice is through delayed obedience. Sometimes a person recognizes clearly what they should do. The message is not confusing. The conviction is strong. Yet instead of acting immediately, they choose to wait. They promise themselves they will respond later, when life becomes easier or when circumstances change. The problem with delayed obedience is that later often never arrives. Time passes, motivation fades, and the urgency of the moment disappears. What once felt like a clear call becomes a distant memory. Bitterness can also silence the voice of God in a person's life. When someone carries unresolved anger or resentment, their heart becomes heavy with pain. That pain can create a barrier that prevents them from hearing guidance that calls them toward forgiveness and healing. Bitterness focuses the mind on past wounds rather than future restoration. The person may hear the call to release that burden, yet they resist because holding on to the pain feels easier than letting it go. Some people ignore God's voice through overconfidence in their own plan. They carefully design their goals, ambitions, and dreams, believing that success depends entirely on their own effort and intelligence. When a moment of spiritual reflection suggests that their path may need adjustment, they push the thought aside because it does not align with their plans. The desire for control becomes stronger than the willingness to listen. Over time, these subtle habits shape the direction of a person's life. Ignoring God rarely happens through a single dramatic decision. It grows quietly through small choices that slowly redirect the heart's attention away from spiritual awareness. Each ignored warning, each delayed response, each moment of rationalization gradually reduces the sensitivity of the conscience. Yet even in the midst of these subtle forms of resistance, the voice of God continues to reach out. It may come through a sudden realization, a conversation that stirs the heart, a message that speaks directly to the soul, or a quiet moment when the mind finally becomes still enough to recognize what has been ignored for so long. The same voice that was once dismissed begins to call again, reminding the heart that truth has not disappeared, that guidance is still available, and that the invitation to listen has never been withdrawn. When a person continually ignores the voice of God, the consequences do not always appear immediately. Life may continue normally for a time, and it may even seem as though nothing has changed. Yet beneath the surface, something begins to shift within the human heart. The conscience becomes less sensitive. The awareness of truth grows weaker, and the distance between the person and God slowly increases. Inspired by the preaching style of Adrian Rogers, the reality becomes clear that spiritual disobedience carries consequences that are deeper and more serious than many people realize. One of the first consequences of spiritual disobedience is a growing sense of inner emptiness. Human beings were created with a spiritual nature that longs for connection with God. When that connection is ignored, the heart begins to feel a quiet restlessness. A person may try to fill that emptiness with success, possessions, relationships, or entertainment, but the satisfaction never lasts. Achievements that once felt exciting begin to lose their meaning. Pleasures that once brought joy become temporary distractions. The deeper hunger of the soul remains unfulfilled because it was never meant to be satisfied by temporary things. Another consequence is confusion about direction in life. When a person stops listening to God's guidance, they begin to rely only on their own understanding. Human wisdom can be useful, but it is limited and often influenced by emotions, pride, and fear. Without divine direction, decisions become more uncertain and the path forward becomes less clear. A person may move from one opportunity to another, chasing success or approval, yet never feel certain that they are truly walking the path they were meant to follow. Spiritual disobedience also weakens the voice of the conscience. At first, when a person makes a choice that goes against truth, the conscience reacts strongly. There may be guilt, discomfort, or a deep sense that something is wrong. However, if the person continues to ignore that warning, the reaction gradually becomes weaker. What once felt unacceptable slowly begins to feel normal. The conscience becomes quieter, not because the action has become right, but because the heart has become less sensitive to truth. This loss of sensitivity can lead to a pattern of repeated mistakes. When people ignore spiritual guidance, they often find themselves making the same harmful decisions again and again. They enter relationships that bring pain, follow paths that lead to disappointment, and repeat behaviors that damage their character. Each cycle creates deeper frustration, yet the root cause remains the same. The guidance that could have prevented these mistakes was ignored. Another consequence of spiritual disobedience is the loss of peace. Peace is more than the absence of problems. It is the deep assurance that life is aligned with truth and purpose. When a person walks in obedience to God, there is often a quiet confidence even during difficult circumstances. However, when a person ignores God as voice, that sense of peace begins to fade. Worry, anxiety, and inattention start to grow. The mind becomes filled with doubts and fears because the foundation of spiritual security has been weakened. Relationships can also suffer as a result of ignoring God's guidance. Many of the principles that God teaches, such as honesty, forgiveness, humility, and compassion, are essential for healthy relationships. When these principles are ignored, conflicts become more frequent and trust becomes harder to maintain. Pride replaces humility, anger replaces patience, and selfishness replaces love. The result is often broken connections and emotional distance between people who once cared deeply for one another. Spiritual disobedience can also create a false sense of independence. A person may begin to believe that they no longer need God's guidance at all. They rely entirely on their own strength, intelligence, and resources. For a time, this independence may feel empowering, especially if life appears successful on the outside. Yet this sense of self-sufficiency is fragile. When unexpected challenges arise, the limits of human strength become clear. There are moments in life that reveal how deeply a person needs spiritual guidance. A crisis appears, a loss occurs, or a difficult decision must be made. In those moments, the confidence that once seemed strong begins to crumble. The person realizes that achievements and possessions cannot answer the deeper questions of the soul. The voice that was once ignored becomes the very voice they wish they had listened to sooner. Another serious consequence of spiritual disobedience is the gradual hardening of the heart. A hardened heart does not develop overnight. It forms slowly as a result of repeated resistance to truth. Each time a person refuses to listen, the heart becomes slightly less responsive. Over time, compassion weakens, humility disappears, and the ability to recognize spiritual truth fades. A hardened heart may still function normally in everyday life, but it becomes increasingly resistant to conviction and change. This condition can create a dangerous illusion. A person may believe they are free simply because they are no longer troubled by guilt or conviction. In reality, the absence of conviction may be a sign that the heart has become too resistant to feel it. The voice that once spoke clearly has been pushed so far away that it is no longer heard. Spiritual disobedience also affects the way a person views truth. Instead of seeking truth with humility, they begin to reshape truth according to their preferences. What feels comfortable becomes acceptable, and what challenges their behavior is rejected. This shifting standard creates confusion not only for the individual but also for those around them. Over time, the consequences extend beyond the individual life. Families, communities, and even entire cultures can be influenced by the collective choices of individuals who ignore spiritual truth. Values begin to shift. Moral boundaries become unclear. And the difference between right and wrong becomes increasingly difficult to recognize. Yet even in the midst of these consequences, the voice of God does not disappear completely. There are still moments when truth breaks through the silence. A message may touch the heart unexpectedly. A conversation may awaken a long-forgotten conviction. A moment of quiet reflection may reveal the path that was once abandoned. The consequences of spiritual disobedience are not merely punishments. They are warnings that reveal the importance of listening to God as voice. They show what happens when the human heart chooses independence over guidance and pride over humility. They reveal how easily a life can drift away from its intended purpose when the voice of truth is ignored. Again and again,